I didn't take the job because I was brave, nor because I had a thirst for adventure. I took it because my bank account was sitting at negative $40. My refrigerator contained only a jar of expired pickles, and my landlord was threatening to change the locks by Friday. The ad on the underground forum was vague, buried under a section for general labor that usually hosted scams or illegal hauling gigs. It simply read, "Caretaker needed for remote property. 30 days, high pay, must be comfortable with large dogs, no internet access, immediate start." The pay listed was $5,000. For a month of work, that was life-changing money for me. It was enough to clear my debts and buy me breathing room. I emailed the contact, a man who signed off simply as Mr. V. He didn't ask for a resume, references, or a background check. He just asked 2 questions: if I could leave immediately, and if I was squeamish about handling large quantities of raw meat. When I said no, he sent me a set of GPS coordinates and a digital contract that vanished from my inbox the moment I signed it. I drove my beat-up sedan 4 hours north, watching the city sprawl dissolve into suburbs, then farmland, and finally dense, oppressive wilderness. The paved roads turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to rutted dirt that threatened to tear the muffler off my car. The trees grew thicker, crowding the road like prison bars blocking out the sky. By the time I reached the coordinates, my GPS had long since died, leaving me navigating by instinct. The property was isolated, a dark stain of a cabin sitting in a clearing of overgrown grass that whispered in the wind. It looked abandoned, a relic of a forgotten time, except for the massive, windowless concrete outbuilding standing 50 yards away from the main house. That had to be the kennel. I parked the car, feeling a cold knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The silence of the woods wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with a threat I couldn't yet name, like the air before a violent storm. The main cabin was dusty but livable, smelling of pine sol and old wood smoke. It had a cast-iron wood stove, a stocked pantry full of canned goods, and a landline phone that hummed with a reassuring dial tone. But my attention was constantly drawn to the outbuilding visible through the kitchen window. Mr. V had left a note on the kitchen table, weighing down a heavy iron keyring. The note was handwritten in sharp, jagged cursive that looked like it had been carved into the paper rather than written. "Welcome, Wyatt. The money is in the floor safe in the bedroom closet. The combination is the date of your arrival. Your only job is to ensure the security of the property and to feed the animal in the bunker. Do not open the inner door under any circumstances. Do not engage with the animal verbally. Feed at 6 p.m. sharp. Use the chute mechanism. Do not be late." I walked out to the concrete bunker, the grass crunching dryly under my boots. It looked less like a dog kennel and more like a military pillbox designed to withstand a bombing run. The walls were thick, reinforced concrete, stained with moss and age. There was a heavy steel door with a sliding viewing port, currently shut tight and bolted from the outside. Next to the door was a metal chute, similar to what you'd see at a bank drive-thru, but much larger and coated in rust. The smell hit me before I even touched the metal handle. It was a musky copper scent, the smell of old blood, wet fur, and something rotting in the heat, amplified by the stagnant summer air. I stepped closer, my heart rate spiking. From inside the concrete walls, I heard a sound that made me freeze in my tracks. It wasn't a bark. It was a deep, chest-rattling chuff, like a tiger pacing in a cage or a massive engine turning over. Whatever was in there was big, much bigger than any dog I had ever seen, and the vibrations of its movements seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I went to the large chest freezer in the shed as instructed, the hinges screaming as I lifted the lid. It was filled to the brim with slabs of meat wrapped in brown butcher paper. Frost clung to the packages, burning my fingertips. I unwrapped one, revealing a massive thigh bone surrounded by thick, dark red muscle. It looked like cow or maybe elk, but the way it was butchered seemed crude, violent. It was heavy, weighing at least 10 pounds, dead weight in my hands. I carried the dripping meat to the bunker as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. The woods seemed to wake up as the light died, the silence replaced by the rustle of leaves. I approached the chute, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled the rusted handle, opening the exterior hatch with a metallic groan. I shoved the meat inside, the blood making the metal slick, and slammed it shut immediately, securing the latch. I waited, holding my breath. For a moment, there was absolute silence, heavy and suffocating. Then I heard the inner hatch of the chute open. There was a wet, tearing sound, followed by the sickening crunch of bone. It sounded like a hydraulic press crushing a walnut, a sharp, explosive snap that echoed through the steel door. The sheer power required to snap a bone that thick with jaws alone was terrifying. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get back to the safety of the car. As I retreated to the cabin, keeping my eyes on the bunker, I felt eyes on me. Not from the bunker, but from the tree line behind me. I spun around, scanning the dense wall of pine and oak. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched was so intense that it made my skin crawl, pricking the hairs on the back of my neck. I hurried inside the cabin and locked the deadbolt, leaning against the door, telling myself it was just nerves, just the isolation playing tricks on a city boy. That night, unable to sleep, I searched the cabin and found a second binder of instructions in the nightstand drawer. It was titled Protocols in black letters. The first few pages were standard caretaker duties: keep the gate locked, check the perimeter fence for rust, maintain the generator. But as I read on, turning the crisp pages by the light of a flickering lamp, the rules became bizarre and deeply unsettling. Rule 4. If you hear vocalizations that sound human coming from the bunker, ignore them. It is a trick of the acoustics in the concrete. Do not respond. Rule 7. Do not look through the viewing port after sunset. The animal is agitated by direct eye contact and reflective light. Rule 9. If the power goes out, light the perimeter flares immediately. Do not step off the porch until dawn. I closed the binder, my hands trembling slightly. What kind of dog mimicked human voices? What kind of animal required perimeter flares like a military forward operating base? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Mr. V was eccentric, a rich survivalist with a paranoia complex. Maybe he owned some exotic hybrid like a high-content wolf dog, and he was just being overly dramatic to ensure I was careful and didn't get bitten. But as I lay in the strange, lumpy bed, listening to the wind howl through the eaves and scratch against the siding, I couldn't shake the memory of that bone snapping. It hadn't sounded like a dog eating. It sounded like a machine designed for destruction. And later, around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that defied all logic. It was a high-pitched whistling coming from the direction of the bunker. It sounded like a man whistling a nursery rhyme, slow, off-key, and dripping with malice. It wasn't acoustic tricks. It was intelligent. The next morning, the bright, harsh sun washed away some of the fear, although the unease remained like a stain. I decided to walk the perimeter of the property as instructed, needing to move my legs. The fence line was impressive. 10 feet high, chain link, topped with razor wire that glinted menacingly in the sunlight. It curved inward at the top, which usually meant the fence was designed to keep things in, preventing them from climbing out. I walked along the gravel path, checking for holes, rust, or weak points. The forest pressed tight against the fence, branches weaving through the links. About halfway around the property, I found a spot where the dirt had been disturbed. It looked like something had been digging, tearing up the earth in frustration, but the dirt was piled up on the outside of the fence. I knelt to inspect the ground, brushing away pine needles. In the dried mud, perfectly preserved, was a print. It was a paw print, shaped like a canine's with a mane pad and 4 toes, but the size was impossible. It was nearly as long as my boot, almost 12 inches. The claws had dug deep into the hard-packed soil, leaving gouges that looked like they were made by steel spikes.
I stood up, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans, my breath catching in my throat. A wolf? A bear? No, bears had 5 toes and a wide, flat pad. This was distinctly canine. But a wolf this size would be a world record, a biological anomaly. I looked out into the dense forest beyond the fence. The woods were silent. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered. It was a dead zone, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I realized then that the razor wire wasn't just to keep the pet inside. It was to keep something else out, something that was trying to get in. By the 3rd day, the isolation was starting to gnaw at my sanity. I hadn't spoken to a soul since I arrived. The only living thing I interacted with was the beast in the bunker, and I had yet to see it fully. Every feeding time was the same ritual. The smell of musk, the heavy breathing from the other side of the wall, and the terrifying crunch of bones that echoed like gunshots. I started feeling like I was the one in the cage. I spent my afternoons sitting on the porch staring at the tree line until my eyes watered. I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision, tall, dark shapes shifting between the trunks, vanishing the moment I focused on them. It was like the shadows were detaching themselves from the trees. I tried to convince myself it was pareidolia, my brain making monsters out of shadows and boredom. But then I found the scratch marks on the cabin. I was bringing in firewood for the stove when I saw them. 3 parallel gouges in the log siding, right next to the back door. They were deep, exposing the raw, pale wood beneath the varnish, and they were about 6 feet off the ground. I placed my hand next to them. My fingers didn't even span the width of the marks. Whatever made them had stood on 2 legs, towering over me, and swiped down with immense force. I checked the perimeter fence again frantically. It was still secure. That meant whatever made these marks was already inside the fence with me. Or the thing in the bunker had gotten out, marked its territory, and put itself back in. The impossibility of it made me nauseous. I stormed out to the bunker, anger momentarily masking my fear. I couldn't live like this, wondering if I was locked in with a monster. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I walked up to the heavy steel door, my boots stomping on the gravel. It was locked tight. The chute was secure. There was no way an animal could open this, wander around, and lock itself back up. "Hey!" I yelled at the concrete wall, my voice cracking. "What are you? Answer me!" Silence. Then a low rumble started from deep within the bunker. It vibrated through the soles of my boots, traveling up my legs. It grew louder, turning into a growl that sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer, deep and resonant. I stepped closer to the viewing port. The rules said, do not look after sunset. It was 2 p.m., the sun high and bright. I was safe. I reached up, my hand shaking, and slid the metal cover aside. At first I saw nothing but darkness. The interior was unlit, a void. Then, movement. Something shifted in the back corner. 2 eyes caught the sliver of light from the port. They were amber, glowing with an inner luminescence that shouldn't exist in nature. And they were high, too high. The creature stepped forward into the shaft of light. I gasped and slammed the port shut, stumbling back and falling onto the gravel. I had seen a snout. I had seen dark matted fur, but the creature had been standing upright, and it had looked at me with an intelligence that no animal should possess, a look of recognition and hatred. I ran back to the cabin and locked the door, sliding the heavy deadbolt home. I grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it in a white-knuckled grip, feeling ridiculous but desperate. I needed to leave. The money wasn't worth this. I went to the landline to call Mr. V and tell him I quit, that he could keep his money and his monster. The line was dead. No hum, no static, just a hollow silence that screamed of isolation. I checked the cord. It had been cut. Not chewed by a rat, cut cleanly as if with wire shears, right where it entered the wall. Panic set in, cold and sharp. I grabbed my car keys and ran out to my sedan.
I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, pumping the gas. Nothing. I popped the hood, dread pooling in my stomach. The battery was gone, ripped right out of its housing, the cables torn and fraying. I was trapped. I went back inside and started tearing the cabin apart, looking for anything, a weapon, a radio, a map, anything that could help. I shoved the heavy oak dining table aside in frustration and noticed a loose floorboard underneath. I pried it up with my fingernails until they bled. Beneath was a small, dusty crawl space containing a metal lockbox. I smashed the lock with a heavy iron fire poker until it gave way. Inside was a leather-bound journal, old and water-damaged, and a heavy revolver with a box of ammunition. The bullets were silver-tipped. The journal belonged to the previous caretaker. I sat on the floor, the gun heavy in my lap, and opened the journal. The pages were crinkled and stained with moisture. The handwriting was shaky, deteriorating into frantic scrawls as the pages went on. Day 5. The feeding is getting harder. It demands more. I think it knows my scent. It smells my fear. Day 12. I saw them in woods today. The pack. They are watching the cabin. They are waiting for him. They know he is the alpha. They are organizing. Day 20. He spoke to me tonight. Through the vent. He offered me a trade. My life for the key. He knows my daughter's name. How does he know her name? I stopped reading, my breath hitching. He spoke. The pack. This wasn't just a monster in a box. It was a leader, a general, and there were others outside waiting for orders. I looked at the date of the last entry. It was only 2 months ago. They are testing the fence. They aren't trying to get in to eat me. They are trying to break him out. I have to reinforce the bunker. God help me, I think the lock is failing. I think I made a mistake with the wiring. I looked out the window at the bunker. It stood silent and gray against the darkening sky, an ominous tomb. The lock. I hadn't checked the lock mechanism itself. I had just assumed it was secure because the door was closed. I had trusted the concrete. Night fell, and with it came the sounds of the siege. It started with a howl, long, mournful, and terrifyingly loud, rising from the deep woods to the north. It was answered by another howl, closer from the west, then another from the south. They were surrounding the property, cutting off every escape route. Then the bunker answered. A roar erupted from the concrete cell, so loud it rattled the cabin windows in their frames. It wasn't an animal noise. It was a challenge, a command issued by a king to his subjects. I gripped the revolver, my knuckles white, spinning the cylinder to ensure it was loaded. The rules made sense now. The flares, the reinforced walls. I wasn't a zookeeper. I was a jailer, guarding a prisoner of war. Something slammed into the side of the cabin with the force of a battering ram. The wood splintered and groaned. I jumped, aiming the gun at the wall. Another slam, this time against the front door. The heavy oak held, but the hinges screamed in protest. They were testing my defenses. I remembered the rule: light the perimeter flares immediately. I scrambled to the pantry where the emergency flares were stored. I grabbed a handful, fumbling with the caps. I ran to the window, cracked it open just an inch, ignited a flare, and threw it onto the front lawn. The red light hissed and sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted like demons. In the crimson glow, I saw them. 3 massive shapes standing on the lawn. They were wolf-like, covered in dark matted fur, but they stood on 2 legs. Their chests were broad, their arms muscular, ending in hands with razor-sharp claws. They shielded their eyes from the flare, snarling with rows of white teeth.
The flares bought me an hour of peace, pushing the creatures back into the tree line. The red light faded to nothing, leaving me in deeper darkness. I sat in the middle of the living room, away from the windows, the revolver pointed at the door, every muscle in my body coiled tight. Then I heard it. A voice coming from right outside the window. "Wyatt." It was a man's voice, calm, reasonable.
It sounded exactly like Mr. V. "Wyatt, it's safe now. Open the door. I'm here to help. We need to check the bunker. The containment is failing." I almost stood up. It sounded exactly like him, the same cadence, the same tone. But then I remembered the rule. If you hear vocalizations that sound human, ignore them. "Wyatt," the voice called again. But this time, the pitch shifted halfway through, dropping into a guttural growl before snapping back to human simulation. "Open the door. Good boy." "Go away!" I screamed, firing a shot into the ceiling just to make noise, just to drown out that impossible voice. Laughter answered me. It wasn't human laughter. It was a chattering, barking sound like hyenas mocking a dying kill, interspersed with wet snorts. "Smart boy," the voice rasped, losing the human facade entirely and becoming a wet, grinding sound. "But the little house is wood. Wood breaks. Flesh breaks." The assault renewed with terrifying fury. They stopped testing and started destroying. Claws raked against the siding, tearing off strips of wood like peeling a banana. I heard heavy items being thrown around. I couldn't stay upstairs. The cabin was a death trap. Too many windows, too many entry points. I grabbed the journal, the gun, and a heavy flashlight and ran to the basement door in the hallway. I threw it open and stumbled down the steep wooden stairs, locking the door behind me and dragging an old metal shelf in front of it as a barricade. The basement was unfinished, smelling of damp earth and mold. It had one small window, high up at ground level, which I had blocked with a piece of plywood earlier. I huddled in the darkest corner behind the furnace, listening to the destruction above. I heard heavy footsteps on the floorboards overhead. Thump, thump. They were inside. The sound of breaking furniture echoed through the vents. They were looking for me. They were hunting. Or were they? The footsteps moved away from the basement door. They didn't try to tear through the floor. They moved toward the back of the house, toward the pantry, toward the food supply. No, they moved toward the back door. They were leaving the cabin. I waited in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the drip of a pipe. The noise upstairs had stopped completely. I crept up the stairs, avoiding the squeaky steps, and pressed my ear to the door. Silence. I slowly moved the shelf and unlocked the door. I peeked out. The cabin was wrecked. The furniture was smashed to kindling, the curtains torn to shreds. The front door was hanging off its hinges, swaying in the night breeze. But the creatures were gone. I looked out the broken kitchen window toward the bunker. The moon was full, illuminating the yard in silver light. The 3 dogmen were standing around the bunker. They weren't attacking it. They were working on it. One of them was using a metal bar, a piece of my perimeter fence, to pry at the hinges of the steel door. Another was smashing the concrete around the frame with a large rock, chipping away at the structure. They were breaking their leader out. They had raided the cabin not for me, but for tools. And from inside, the Alpha was slamming against the door in rhythm with their strikes. Boom, boom, boom. The metal began to buckle outward. I realized then that if that door opened, I was dead. The pack might ignore me for now, focused on their mission, but the Alpha, the one I had been starving, the one I had kept imprisoned in the dark, he would want revenge. I checked the revolver, 5 shots in the cylinder. The box of ammo in my pocket had 10 more. Silver-tipped hollow points. The previous caretaker knew what these things were, even if he hadn't survived them. I had to stop them. I couldn't just hide in the basement and wait for them to come for me. If the Alpha got out, they would roam the countryside. They would reach the nearest town. They would kill anyone they found. I crept out the back door, moving through the tall grass, staying low. The wind was in my favor, blowing toward me, carrying their scent, a thick stench of rot, wet dog, and ozone. I made it to the shed where the generator was housed. I had an idea. The electric fence was powered by this generator, but the perimeter wires had been cut days ago. However, the bunker door. Mr. V had mentioned an electrified failsafe in the manual, a last resort. I fumbled with the breaker box in the dark shed, finding the switch labeled Emergency Lockdown. If I flipped this switch, it would send a massive voltage charge through the steel door of the bunker. It was meant to deter the animal from scratching, but maybe, just maybe, it would shock the ones touching it outside, too. I grabbed the lever. It was rusted stiff. I pulled with all my weight, gritting my teeth. The lever snapped down with a metallic clunk. The generator roared to life, the sudden noise deafening in the quiet night. A shower of blue sparks erupted from the bunker door. A loud crack like lightning echoed across the clearing. The two dogmen touching the door were thrown back violently. They convulsed on the ground, smoke rising from their fur, their limbs twitching uncontrollably. The smell of burning hair filled the air instantly. The third one, the one with the pry bar, hadn't been touching the metal. It roared in surprise and spun around, scanning the darkness for the source of the trap. Its yellow eyes locked on the shed. It saw the open door. It saw me. It dropped to all fours and sprinted. The speed was unnatural, a blur of motion. It covered the 50 yards between us in seconds, clumps of dirt flying up behind its claws. I raised the revolver. My hands shook uncontrollably. I aimed for the center of mass, trying to steady my breath. Bang! The shot went wide, hitting the dirt to its left. The creature leapt, clearing the distance in a single bound, jaws opening wide. Bang! The second shot hit it in the shoulder. The creature yelped, a human-like scream of pain that chilled my blood, and stumbled. It rolled, snarling, snapping at the wound, but kept coming. I didn't wait to see if it was down. I ran. I ran toward the woods, away from the cabin, away from the bunker. It was a stupid plan, running into their territory, but I had nowhere else to go. The cabin was breached. The car was dead. Behind me, I heard the heavy thudding of paws hitting the earth. The wounded one was chasing me, and the other two were recovering, their growls joining the pursuit. I crashed through the underbrush, thorny branches whipping my face and tearing my clothes. I heard its breath, a wet, rasping sound getting closer. Huff, huff, huff. I tripped over an exposed root and sprawled into the dirt, winded. I rolled onto my back, raising the revolver, preparing for the end. The dogman burst through the bushes, towering over me. It was 7 feet tall, its fur matted with blood from the shoulder wound. It raised a clawed hand to swipe, a look of pure malice in its eyes. Bang! I fired point-blank into its chest. The silver bullet hit home. The creature froze mid-swing. It gargled, black blood spilling from its mouth, and collapsed on top of me. The weight was crushing, pinning me to the forest floor. The smell was unbearable, hot copper and rot. I struggled out from under the heavy corpse, gasping for air, coated in its dark, viscous blood. A metallic screech tore through the night, drowning out the ringing in my ears. I froze, looking back through the trees. I looked toward the clearing. The bunker door was gone, ripped off its hinges and thrown 10 feet away. A shadow emerged from the concrete cell. It was massive, bigger than the others by at least 2 feet. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its shoulders wide enough to block the doorway. Its fur was silver-tipped, shimmering in the moonlight like armor. The Alpha. It stepped out, shaking its massive head, stretching limbs that had been confined for weeks. It sniffed the air, taking in the world. It looked at the two dogmen recovering on the ground. Then it looked toward the woods, toward me. It threw its head back and howled. It wasn't the howl of the hunt. It was a howl of victory, a declaration of freedom. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle. I had to get to the main road, even if I had to walk 20 miles in the dark. But then, the alpha stopped howling. It dropped to all fours, and it started running. Not toward me. It was running toward the logging road, toward the town. It had bigger plans than revenge on a single feeder. I stood there, confused, adrenaline crashing. Why ignore me? I was the jailer. I was the one who had kept it trapped. Then I realized I wasn't the target. I was just the hired help. Mr. V, the contact, he wasn't the owner of the beast. The alpha was the owner of this land. The journal entry flashed in my mind. He offered me a trade, my life, for the key. The previous caretaker hadn't escaped. He had been eaten. But before he died, he hadn't reinforced the lock to keep the beast in. He had weakened it. He had sabotaged the generator wires to fail. He had made a deal with the devil. I looked at the dead dogman next to me. As the life faded from it, its features seemed to shift, the muscles relaxing. The snout shortened slightly. The claws retracted halfway. It didn't turn into human. This wasn't Hollywood. But it looked less monstrous. The anatomy shifted. It looked more like a man trapped in a biological suit that had fused with his skin. These weren't demons. They were mutated men. I felt a stinging sensation on my arm. I looked down. During the struggle, the dead dogman had scratched me. A shallow cut, 3 jagged lines on my forearm where the claw had grazed me. The wound was burning like fire. The blood coming out of it wasn't bright red. It was dark, almost black and sluggish. I remembered the smell of the shoot, the raw meat, the infection. It wasn't a curse. It was a biological agent, a virus. Mr. V had hired me not to guard a pet, but to incubate a test subject, or maybe to be the next meal if I survived the month. I was immune, or maybe I was just intended to be fresh meat for the pack when they eventually broke their leader out. I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. The other 2 dogmen were coming. They had recovered from the shock. I didn't run this time. I felt a strange heat rising in my chest, a rage that wasn't my own. My fear was evaporating, replaced by a primal need to fight, to dominate. I looked at my hand. The nails looked sharper. The skin looked tougher, grayish in the moonlight. The transformation wasn't weeks away. It was reacting to the adrenaline. I reloaded the revolver with shaky hands. 2 bullets left. The other 2 dogmen emerged from the trees, slinking low. They slowed down when they saw me standing over their packmate. They sniffed the air, confused. They didn't attack. They lowered their heads. They whined, a sound of submission. They smelled the alpha's blood on me? No, they smelled the scratch. They smelled the infection taking hold. They smelled the virus replicating in my blood. I wasn't prey anymore. I was pack, or at least I was something close enough to give them pause. I raised the gun. "Back off," I yelled. My voice sounded deeper, rougher, vibrating in my chest. The dogmen hesitated. They looked at each other, communicating silently, then turned and ran into the woods, following the path of the alpha. They had a leader to follow, and I wasn't it. Not yet. I walked back to the cabin. My leg felt broken or sprained, but I could still walk. The pain was distant, dull, as if my nerve endings were being rewired. I went into the kitchen wreckage and found the first aid kit. I poured alcohol on the scratch. It fizzed and smoked, burning intensely, but the wound didn't close. The skin around it was turning gray and hard, like a callus forming over the injury. I found the satellite phone Mr. V had hidden in the wall safe. I hadn't seen it before because I hadn't looked deep enough into the crawlspace. I dialed the number saved in the contacts. It rang once. "Mr. V," I rasped when the line connected. "Wyatt." The voice was surprised, smooth and cultured. "You're alive. That is, unexpected." "He's out! The Alpha is out! The pack took him!" Silence on the line. Then a sigh. "That is unfortunate. Phase 2 begins early then. We hoped for more containment time." "What did you do to me?" I growled, clutching the table. "You're a carrier now, Wyatt. Don't worry. The change usually takes weeks. You have time to get your affairs in order. Or you can come work for us properly. We always need new assets." I smashed the phone against the wall, shattering it into plastic shards. I was hungry, a deep, gnawing pit in my stomach, not for food, for meat, for blood. I opened the freezer in the shed. The raw slabs of beef, the ones that had disgusted me days ago, didn't look repulsive anymore. They looked appetizing. I could smell the iron in them. I reached out, trembling, and grabbed a piece of raw steak. I almost took a bite. I slammed the freezer door shut. No, I wouldn't give in. I was still human. I was still Wyatt. I grabbed the keys from the dead caretaker's pocket. I had found his skeletal remains in the tall grass on my way back, hidden by the overgrown weeds. His jeep was parked behind the shed, covered in a tarp. It started with a roar. I drove down the gravel road, the sun rising in the rearview mirror. I needed a hospital or a CDC lab, someone who could stop this. But as I drove, my vision sharpened. I could see every leaf on the trees blurring past. I could smell a deer 3 miles in the woods away. The world was becoming brighter, louder, more intense. I reached the first town, Hollow Creek. It was a small, sleepy hamlet. It was quiet, too quiet. But there was something wrong. The streets were empty. Cars were abandoned with doors open in the middle of the road. I saw a police cruiser crashed into a storefront, its lights still flashing weakly. The Alpha had been here. He hadn't just run through. He had stopped. I stopped the jeep and got out, drawing the revolver. I went into the general store. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully. The clerk was behind the counter, or what had left of him. The throat had been torn out. The devastation was absolute. This wasn't just an escape. This was a massacre. The Alpha was building an army, and he needed bodies to infect or to feed the pack. He was clearing the board. I stood in the wreckage of the town, the smell of blood thick in the air. I felt the virus pulsing in my veins, syncing with my heartbeat. I could feel where the Alpha was. It was like a compass needle in my brain, a magnetic pole dragging me north. I looked at the reflection in the shattered store window. My eyes were yellowing, the pupil slightly elongated. My teeth looked sharper, crowding my mouth.
I climbed back into the jeep, the leather seat creaking under my weight. I loaded the last 2 silver bullets into the revolver, whispering a prayer over them. I wouldn't let Mr. V win. I wouldn't let the Alpha turn this world into a feeding ground. I was the bridge between man and monster, and I would be the one to burn it down. I revved the engine. The pull in my head was strong. He was close, heading for the mountains. No,
I wasn't trapped with them anymore. They were trapped with me. The feed is over. The contract is void. The hunt begins.